Dear students, today we are reading Father to Son. This is a poem written by Elizabeth Jennings. So I hope you are ready for some poetry. Before we start, just a few words about the author. Elizabeth Jennings was born in 1926 in England. She was an English poet whose works relate intensely personal matters in a plain-spoken, traditional and objective style. As a writer, she exalted formalism, striving to maintain a sense of tradition through regular meter and order. Her desire to be in communion with others and her need for isolation was a constant topic of discussion in her letters as well as a theme in her poetry. When read in context with her biographical accounts, her poetry can be understood as an almost obsessive quest to fully understand herself. Many of her poems have a devotional aspect. Her intense musing on spirituality encouraged a sensitivity towards others, evident in the pain tenderness of some of her poems. She led an extraordinary life. She was the only woman to join the movement, an English group of poets dedicated to an anti-romantic aesthetic. At the end of her life, she struggled with poverty and ill health. She was known in her later life as the bag lady of poetry, due to her immense poverty. Today we are reading Father to Son, a poem written by Elizabeth Jennings. I do not understand this child, though we have lived together now in the same house for years. I know nothing of him, so try to build up a relationship from how he was when small. Yet, have I killed the seed I spent, or sown it where the land is his and none of mine? We speak like strangers. There is no sign of understanding in the air. The child is built to my design, yet what he loves I cannot share. Silence surrounds us. I would have him prodigal, returning to his father's house, the home he knew, rather than see him make and move his world. I would forgive him too, shaping from sorrow a new love. Father and son, we both must live on the same globe and the same land. He speaks. I cannot understand myself. Why anger grows from grief. We each put out an empty hand, longing for something to forgive. The poem is about the relationship between a father and a son, and the complications involved in it. The central idea of the poem is the generation gap, which occurs when the communication link between two generations breaks due to a mutual lack of understanding, tolerance, and acceptance. The poem reveals an internal conflict that a father undergoes when his son grows up and has his own interests, ideas, and perceptions. The father complains that he cannot understand his child despite having lived together for so many years, in the same house. They have drifted apart, and the gap has resulted in non-communication. There is silence. They don't speak to each other. In the first stanza, it is said, "I do not understand this child, though we have lived together now in the same house for years. I know nothing of him, so try to build up a relationship from how he was when small." The father unhappily reflects on his inability to understand his own son. They have been staying in the same house for years, but due to non-communication and a lack of understanding, both son and father are not able to understand each other. The father doesn't know much about his son's interests, likes or dislikes. He says, "I do not understand this child." He is calling his son a child, although his son is a grown man now. Calling his son a child is a sort of distancing. He says, "I do not understand this child, though we have lived together now in the same house for years. I know nothing of him, so try to build up a relationship from how he was when small." Here we can see that the father says he is trying to build up a relationship from how he was when small. To build up means to develop. However, his father says he wants to build up a relationship from how he was when small. However, his child is a grown man now. The father doesn't accept his child has grown. Yet have I killed the seed I spent, or sown it where the land is his and none of mine? The first stanza ends with a metaphorical question which continues in the second stanza. Yet have I killed the seed I spent, or sown it where the land is his and none of mine? This question conveys the way in which the father resents the son's growing independence. The first possibility, yet have I killed the seed I spent. This is the first possibility, and this is the second one. Sown it, did I sown it where the land is his and none of mine? The first possibility suggests that the father recognizes nothing of himself in his son. His son seems to have become completely different from him. The second one, or sown it where the land is his and none of mine. The second possibility makes reference to the fact that the son has grown independent. Both possibilities present the seed as a metaphor that originated a boy and that should have, but apparently has not, left on him the genetic imprint of the father. In the first case, The sowing seems to have been a useless waste, as the seed seems to be killed. In the second case, it seems that the father's part ended as soon as the seed was planted, as the growing process took part in an alien land. We speak like strangers. There is no sign of understanding in the air. This child is built to my design, yet what he loves I cannot share. The father wonders whether it is he himself who is responsible for the failure of the relationship. The father feels that though the child is his son, but perhaps he lives in a world different from him. Both father and son behave like strangers. There is a lack of understanding and a communication gap which makes them behave not like father and son, but more like strangers. The father says that physically the child resembles him, but he doesn't appreciate what his son likes. Father feels very helpless and can't understand his own child. Both the father and the son are poles apart. In this stanza of Father to Son, the poet shows the self-centeredness of the father, who, though wishes to design his son's life according to his own, when it comes sharing what his son likes and feels pleasure in, he avoids revealing it. Where he once used to think that his son would not be able to design his life, now it is time to talk about his son's preferences, and he feels ashamed of revealing them. Here, what he loves may mean many different things. And when he says, I cannot share, it may mean a lot. These could be good things or bad things. However, the father doesn't want to reveal it. Silence surrounds us. I would have him prodigal, returning to his father's house, the home he knew, rather than see him make and move his world. I would forgive him too, shaping from sorrow a new love. Silence surrounds us refers to silence which is there. It refers to the son and the father who are not talking to each other. Prodigal means extravagant, wasteful. It means spending money or using resources freely and recklessly. It means lavish, liberal, and generous also. The father says, silence surrounds us. A short and effective sentence, silence surrounds us, emphasizes the lack of communication between the father and the son. They do not speak to each other. Their outlook and temperament are so different that they remain separated from each other. They have a communication gap along with the generation gap, which causes the silence. In this stanza, the father sees his son as the prodigal son who is spendthrift and would soon return to his father's house, which was once his very own. The father says he is willing to forgive him at any cost, so that he returns to his father's home instead of moving out into a new house and fall into perhaps some unnecessary troubles due to young age. The prodigal son is a reference from the Bible. The story is of a father with two sons. The younger demanded his inheritance despite the fact that traditionally the eldest born is the one who gets the inheritance. So the father agrees and he gives the inheritance to his younger son. The younger son leaves home. He spends his fortune foolishly, eventually returning to his father's house with barely a stitch of cloth on his body. And the father forgives him and welcomes him into his embrace with open arms and a celebratory feast. This is a reference to the passage, the parable of the prodigal son. The words "I would have" suggests the father would like to have a choice in his son's life, but he doesn't. The father would rather see his son returning to him in need, like the son in the parable of the Bible, than have him grow independent. Make and move his world. This refers to the independence. The father doesn't want his son to have the independence, to grow independent. We can conclude that the father is oppressive. Father feels very helpless and he can't understand his own child. Both the father and the son are poles apart, and it saddens him to realize that he has never tried to understand his son's perspective, due to which his son has distanced himself from him. However, we can see that the father is oppressive. He doesn't want his son to go and live his life. Moreover, the use of the third person possessive adjective in the phrase his world suggests that the father resents not being included in the boy's world, in his son's world. On the other hand, the word world conveys the idea of an enormous and free space, which contrasts with house, which means the confined space where the father would like to, so to say, cage his son. The father wishes his son to live and struggle so that his child can learn about the bitterness of his life and become mature after having encountered the ups and downs of life. However, one of the reasons of the generation gap is absence of understanding and communication. In the poem, we hear only the father's point of view. The root cause of the generation gap has been lack of sharing of interest, as well as not paying attention to the child's emotional needs while growing up. The silence between them continues, and the father cannot see his own limitations, trying to construct the relationship from preconceptions which are far away from reality. He doesn't accept his child as grown and treats him as if he were still a child, commanding him to behave according to his orders. Father and son, we both must live on the same globe and the same land. He speaks, I cannot understand myself, why anger grows from grief. We each put out an empty hand, longing for something to forgive. Father and son, we both must live on the same globe and the same land. Both fathers and their sons all over the world must learn to live together in spite of their misunderstandings and differences. At this point in the poem, the son will also speak, for the first time in the poem. In this stanza, to put out means to extend. We each put out, we each extend an empty hand. To long for means to desire keenly or strongly, to crave for or to miss someone. In this stanza, it is said that both father and son must live on the same globe and the same land. This is what father says. Now we can see from the house shifting to the same globe and the same land. The word globe symbolizes the world of emotions and feelings. The land can symbolize the space of their house where both the father and son lived. Both of them must have an understanding to coexist on both issues for a better relationship. In this stanza, the father is shown and left lamenting and complaining, but he doesn't want to provide any solution. Similarly, the son is shown to be ready to reconcile and live again as they used to live. But this doesn't end the problem of the generation gap that remains between the father and the son. As a sign of reconciliation, each of them welcomes one another to live friendly. Both father and son want to forgive each other. However, neither is ready to take the first step. Neither is ready to ask for forgiveness from the other. The son also cannot understand himself. He doesn't understand why anger grows from grief. However, the situation can improve if they find a way of getting closer to each other. The poem Father to Son describes the relationship between a father and a son. However, its appeal is fairly universal. What happens in the poem happens to most fathers and sons. The structure of society is such that the father expects his son to follow his wishes, leading to individuality clashes. Through one personal experience, the poet wants to throw light on a common and universal problem, that is, the generation gap. The poem doesn't follow a consistent rhyme scheme. It follows its own scheme. The poem is divided into 4 stanzas of 6 lines each. Now let's find some phrases and lines that indicate distance between father and son. For example, first line, I do not understand this child. Or for example, I know nothing of him. We speak like strangers. There's no sign of understanding. What he loves, I cannot share. Silence surrounds us. He speaks, I cannot understand. These are some phrases and lines that indicate deep differences between father and son. Now let's find some poetic devices used in the poem. First of all, alliteration. This figure of speech indicates occurrence or repetition of the same first consonant sound close together in a series. For example, the seed I spent or sown it. We can see there is a repetition of consonant S. Or, for example, we speak like strangers. There is no sign. Here as well we can see occurrence of letter S. Or, for example, silence surrounds us. Consonant S. Another example of alliteration is his father's house, the home he knew. Letter H. Next example of alliteration is shaping from sorrow. Or, for example, why anger grows from grief. Here we have letter G. Alliteration is a figure of speech that indicates occurrence or repetition of the same first consonant sound close together in a series. These are some examples of alliteration. Now let's find some examples of metaphor. Metaphor means an implied comparison is made between two unlike things that actually have something in common. For example, the seed I spent or sown it. Or the land is his and none of mine. Another example of metaphor is his father's house. Metaphor means an implied comparison is made between two unlike things that actually have something in common. Another poetic device used in the poem is antithesis. Let's find some examples of antithesis. In this figure of speech, two contrasting or opposing ideas are put together. One example is, the land is his and none of mine. Here we have two contrasting or opposing ideas that are put together. Or, for example, shaping from sorrow a new love. Here we have again sorrow and love. These are two contrasting or opposing ideas that are put together. These are some examples of antithesis. Now let's find some examples of Synecdoche. In this figure of speech, a part is made to represent the whole or vice versa. We call this figure of speech Synecdoche. One example is make and move his world. This is an example of Synecdoche, a figure of speech where a part is made to represent the whole, or vice versa, to make and move his world. Another poetic device used in the poem is Enjambment. Enjambment is the continuation of a sentence or clause across a line break. For example, in the same house for years. I know, here we can see that the statement is not finished. It continues in the next line. Another example of enjambment is nothing of him, so try to build. Another example is up a relationship from now. Here again, the line is not finished. Some more examples of enjambment are the seed I spent or sonnet, where, here again we can see, the statement is not finished. If it stays alone, it makes no sense. We have to continue reading. The seed I spent or sonnet, where the land is his and none of mine. This second line will not be enjambment because it is a finished statement. Another example of enjambment is we speak like strangers. There's no sign of understanding. Again, we can see that the statement is not finished. It continues in the next line. But the next line will not be enjambment because the statement is complete. Another example is silence surrounds us. I would have. And another one is him prodigal returning to his father's house. We can see that these lines are not completed. In order for these lines to have sense, we have to continue reading the next line. Enjambment refers to the continuation of a sentence or clause across a line break. These are some examples of enjambment. One more poetic device used in the poem is Seizure. Seizure refers to a break or pause in the middle of a line of verse. It is formed by the rhythms of natural speech rather than by metrics. For example, silence surrounds us. I would have. Here we can see there is a break or pause in the middle of a line or verse. Or for example, him prodigal, returning to. Another example is his father's house, the home he knew. One more example of Seizure is father and son, we both must live. And another one is he speaks, I cannot understand. In these examples, we can see that there is a break or pause in the middle of a line. Silence surrounds us. Naturally, we stop here. I would have, this is first example. I would have him prodigal, returning to. Here as well, there is a small short break. His father's house. Again, there is a break. The home he knew. Father and son. We both must live. This is another example. And he speaks. I cannot understand. Seizure refers to a break or pause in the middle of a line, of a verse. It is formed by the rhythms of natural speech rather than by metrics. These are some poetic devices used in the poem. Dear students, this is all for today. Have a nice day and see you soon.